The journey to the university felt like a pilgrimage. Every mile marker on the highway seemed to tick off a year of struggle, a silent monument to a promise I had made to myself and my daughter. The sun cast a brilliant, almost heavenly glow over the city as I drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel of my old, sputtering car. It was a machine kept alive by prayer and the occasional, costly visit to a mechanic who knew my story. Today, of all days, I had prayed it would not fail me. Pulling into the vast parking lot, I was immediately struck by the sheer scale of the celebration. Sleek, polished cars slid into spaces around me, their doors opening to release families dressed in their absolute finest. Laughter and excited chatter filled the air, a foreign symphony of carefree joy. For a moment, I felt a pang of inadequacy. My dress, a simple blue sheath I'd bought on clearance years ago, suddenly felt plain. My single, lovingly chosen rose for Lily, a stark contrast to the extravagant bouquets clutched in the hands of others. But then I took a deep breath, the scent of freshly cut grass and warm asphalt grounding me. This wasn't a competition. This was a finish line. Our finish line. Inside, the auditorium was a cavern of polished oak and deep red velvet. It hummed with a palpable energy, a collective thrum of anticipation and pride. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and floral arrangements. I found my assigned seat, a bit further back than I would have liked, and smoothed the fabric of my dress, my hands trembling slightly. It was really happening. The dream that had felt so distant for so long, a shimmering mirage on a desperate horizon, was finally, breathtakingly real. I let my gaze drift over the parents around me. The man to my right wore a suit so sharp it could have cut glass. His wife's pearls were a soft, milky constellation at her throat. They spoke in low, confident tones about a celebratory trip to Europe. I overheard snippets of conversations about legacy admissions, corporate law firms, and summer homes. I felt like an observer from another world, a visitor peering into a life of effortless success. My own success felt anything but effortless. It was etched in the fine lines around my eyes, in the permanent ache in my lower back from years of standing on my feet, cleaning the homes of people just like these. Then, I scanned the sea of navy blue caps and gowns on the floor below, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My eyes searched for that one familiar face, the one that had been my compass for 18 long years. And then I saw her, Lily. She was talking to a friend, her head tilted back in a laugh that was pure, unadulterated joy. It was a sound I knew better than my own name. As if she could feel my gaze, her head turned and her eyes, the same deep brown as mine, locked onto me across the expansive hall. The noise, the crowd, the entire world seemed to dissolve in that instant. There was only my daughter's smile, a radiant beacon that cut through the distance and wrapped me in a warmth that no designer suit or string of pearls could ever provide. She gave me our special wave, a subtle wiggle of her fingers, a secret language that had carried us through parent-teacher conferences, scraped knees, and teenage heartbreaks. In that silent, shared moment, I saw the entire gallery of her life flash before my eyes. The tiny infant swaddled in a hospital blanket, the gap-toothed first grader proudly holding up a finger painting, the determined young woman hunched over textbooks at our small kitchen table late into the night. My throat tightened with an emotion so fierce it almost hurt. This day wasn't just about a diploma. It was about the nights I'd come home, my body screaming with exhaustion, only to find her waiting up to read a chapter of her favorite book to me. It was about the meals I'd skipped, claiming I wasn't hungry, so she could have the last of the chicken. It was about every whispered prayer in the dark, every silent tear of fear, every ounce of strength I had scraped from the bottom of my soul to build this future for her. The formal procession began, and the dean's voice boomed from the speakers, a resonant, authoritative sound that seemed to signal the official start of Lily's new life. I knew her father, Mark, was here. I hadn't seen him yet, but I could feel his presence, a cold spot in the otherwise warm atmosphere. I imagined him, impeccably dressed, surrounded by his new, perfect family, ready to claim a sliver of the pride that he had done so little to earn. A familiar bitterness threatened to rise, but I swallowed it down. Today was about Lily. It was about the light, not the shadows. I clutched the single rose, its velvety petals a soft, grounding comfort. This one perfect flower represented a love that was singular, focused, and unconditional. It was a love that had weathered the harshest storms and had, against all odds, bloomed. Watching Lily on that stage, a poised and brilliant young woman, was like looking at a masterpiece I had helped create. But beneath the pride, the memories of the raw materials, the tears, the sweat, the fear swirled within me. Mark's presence in the auditorium, unseen but deeply felt, was a cold draft that threatened to chill the warmth of the day. It was impossible not to remember the man he had been, and the man he had become. Our life together had started simply enough, in a small apartment with mismatched furniture and big dreams. I worked as a waitress to support him through his business degree, believing in his ambition with every fiber of my being. I saw his potential as a shared future, a mountain we were climbing together. But the higher he climbed, the more he seemed to look down, not just at the world, but at me. My hands, calloused from carrying hot plates, were no longer the hands he wanted to hold at his corporate dinners. My simple, earnest stories about my day bored him. I was, he once said in a moment of cruel honesty, a relic from his past, a starter wife who no longer fit the upgraded version of his life. The day he left was quiet and surgical. There was no shouting, no dramatic slamming of doors, just a calm, chilling pronouncement that we had grown in different directions. He had packed a single leather suitcase, leaving behind everything else, including, it felt, the 15 years of our shared history. Lily was only 6. I remember her standing in the doorway of her room, clutching her teddy bear, her small face a canvas of confusion. "Where is Daddy going?" she had asked, her voice a tiny whisper. "He has to go on a long work trip, sweetie." I had lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It was the first of many lies I would have to tell to shield her from a truth that was too heavy for her small shoulders to bear. Our world shrank overnight. We moved from our modest house to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and temperamental plumbing. My life became a relentless cycle of work, sleep, and motherhood. I took on a second job, cleaning houses in the affluent suburbs where Mark now lived. Sometimes I would drive past his new, sprawling home, with its manicured lawn and gleaming windows, and a wave of dizzying injustice would wash over me. He paid his child support, always on time, a neat, impersonal transaction that covered the bare essentials, but did nothing to fill the gaping hole he had left in our lives. He was providing resources, but he had abdicated his role. He was a shareholder in her life, not a partner in raising her. He would visit on alternating weekends, swooping in like a rich uncle from a foreign land. He brought expensive, complicated toys that Lily would play with for a day before returning to the simple, worn-out dolls she and I would create stories for. He'd take her to fancy restaurants where she would squirm uncomfortably, unused to the hushed atmosphere and multiple forks. During these brief, performative handoffs, his gaze would sweep over me, a flicker of something between pity and disdain in his eyes. He'd ask if I needed anything, not out of genuine concern, but as a way of reinforcing the power dynamic, of reminding me that he was the success and I was the charity case. It was during one of those exchanges that he first planted the seed. He was dropping Lily off, and she was chattering excitedly about a school project I had stayed up until 2 a.m. helping her with. "Her nanny is very dedicated, I'll give you that," he said to his new wife, who was waiting in the car, her expression impassive. He hadn't said it to me, but at me. The word hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Nanny, a paid employee, a service provider. It was his way of erasing our history, of demoting me from the role of a wife and mother to that of a caretaker. It was a neat, cruel way to package our story for his new, glossy life. From then on, it became his quiet, cutting moniker for me in conversations with his new circle. Now, sitting in this grand hall, the weight of that word pressed down on me. For years, I had swallowed the hurt, plastering on a smile for Lily's sake. I had been the one to pack her lunches, to soothe her fevers, to hold her when she cried over a broken heart. I had been the one who taught her to be kind, to be strong, to look people in the eye. I had not been her nanny. I had been her mother. And as I watched her prepare to step into the future, I had given everything to build. A fierce, protective love roared to life inside me. Today there would be no more shadows. Today, there would only be the truth. The ceremony concluded with a triumphant crescendo of music. Caps flew into the air, a kaleidoscope of navy blue against the bright lights, and the auditorium erupted in a wave of thunderous applause and joyous shouts. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony. Parents surged towards the floor, their faces beaming, arms outstretched to embrace their graduates. For a moment, I remained seated, letting the scene wash over me, trying to imprint every detail onto my memory. I wanted to hold on to this feeling of pure, unadulterated triumph before stepping back into the reality of the world. Clutching my single rose, I finally stood and began to make my way through the throng of people, my eyes fixed on finding Lily. The crowd was a thick, slow-moving river of celebration. I exchanged polite smiles and nods with strangers, all of us bound by the shared joy of the day. As I neared the designated meeting area, my heart beat a little faster. I could see Lily, surrounded by a group of her friends, her laughter ringing out like the clearest bell. And then, I saw him. Mark was making his way towards her from the opposite direction, his new wife, an elegant, statuesque woman named Caroline, at his side. He moved through the crowd with an easy, confident grace, as if he were parting the Red Sea. Several people stopped him, shaking his hand, patting him on the back. He was in his element, a successful man accepting congratulations for an achievement he viewed, no doubt, as a successful investment. Our paths converged just a few feet from where Lily was standing. A small group of Mark's colleagues, men in equally sharp suits, had joined him. He saw me approaching, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face before he composed it into a mask of cordial politeness. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice smooth and proprietary. He placed a hand on my arm, a gesture that felt less like an inclusion and more like a claim of ownership. "Gentlemen," he announced to his friends, "I'd like you to meet someone very special. This woman has been an incredible force in Lily's life." My breath hitched. For one wild, hopeful second, I thought he was going to give me my due. I thought that maybe, just this once, on this day of all days, he would acknowledge the truth of our journey. My heart swelled with a fragile, tentative hope. His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. They remained cold, calculating. He looked directly at me, then turned back to his friends. "We were so lucky to have her." "This is Carla," he said. And then came the blow, delivered with the casual, effortless cruelty of a man who has never known what it feels like to be invisible. She was Lily's nanny for years, an absolute godsend. Nanny. The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. It sucked the air from my lungs and the warmth from my skin. The joyful noise of the auditorium seemed to recede, replaced by a dull, roaring sound in my ears. Nanny. It was one thing to say it in a private, cutting remark. It was another to announce it here, in this public space of celebration, in front of his successful friends, as if my entire identity, my entire sacrifice, could be summed up in a job title. He had erased me. With one word, he had relegated 15 years of motherhood, the sleepless nights, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories, the unwavering love, to a transaction. I was the hired help. The men around him smiled politely, their gazes sliding over me with a newfound understanding. I was no longer the mother of a graduate in their eyes. I was the domestic staff. I could see the recategorization happening in their expressions. My simple dress, my single rose, my worn-out shoes, it all suddenly made sense to them in the most humiliating way possible. I felt my face flush with a hot, prickling shame. I wanted to speak, to scream, to correct him, but my voice was trapped in my throat, strangled by a knot of pain and disbelief. I could do nothing but stand there, impaled by his casual cruelty, the single rose in my hand suddenly feeling like a foolish, pathetic prop. It was in that moment of frozen silence that Lily turned. She had seen the gathering and was walking towards us, her face lit with the brilliant smile I cherished more than anything. "Mom! Dad!" she called out. As she drew closer, her smile faltered. She was exceptionally perceptive, always attuned to the emotional currents around her. She saw the tight, false smile on her father's face. She saw the polite, dismissive glances from his friends. And then she saw me. She saw the look on my face, the naked pain I was trying so desperately to hide. Her eyes, so full of joy just seconds before, narrowed with a fierce, protective focus. She didn't stop to ask what was wrong. She didn't hesitate. She walked past her father as if he were a stranger, her eyes locked on mine. She took my hand, her grip firm and sure, and then she took the rose from my other hand, holding it like a scepter. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the polite chatter. Without another word, she turned away from all of us. She didn't look at her father. She didn't look at his stunned colleagues. She looked towards the stage, where the dean was still shaking hands and posing for photos. With a resolve that seemed to radiate from her very core, she began walking, not towards the exit, but back towards the stage, back towards the podium and the microphone that stood there, silent and waiting. A hush fell over our small group as we watched Lily walk away. Mark's smile finally vanished, replaced by a look of utter confusion, which quickly morphed into annoyance. "Lily? What is she doing?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. His friends shifted their weight, their polite smiles now looking strained and uncertain. I stood frozen, my hand still tingling where she had gripped it, my mind struggling to catch up with her actions. I could only watch, a spectator to my own daughter's courage. Lily moved with a purpose that was both terrifying and magnificent. She ascended the small set of stairs to the stage, her blue gown flowing behind her like a royal train. The dean, a kindly-looking man with a gentle smile, saw her approaching and looked puzzled, but he made no move to stop her. The auditorium was still filled with a celebratory buzz, but a few heads were starting to turn, drawn by the unusual sight of a lone graduate returning to the stage. She reached the podium, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing wooden structure. She adjusted the microphone, and the slight squeak it made as she lowered it to her height echoed through the cavernous hall. It was just loud enough to cut through the lingering chatter. A ripple of curiosity spread through the remaining crowd. Conversations faltered. More heads turned. Then she spoke. "Excuse me," she said again, her voice steady and clear, amplified now for all to hear. It was not a timid request. It was a command for attention. And she got it. The buzz of conversation died down almost instantly, replaced by a focused, expectant silence. Several hundred pairs of eyes were now fixed on her. "I know the ceremony is over, but I have one more thing to say. One more person to thank." My heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel Mark's posture stiffen beside me. He took a half step forward, as if he might try to intervene, but he was too late. Lily had the stage, and she had the audience. She lifted the single rose I had brought for her, holding it up for everyone to see. "This rose," she began, her voice ringing with a profound, unwavering conviction, "is from my mother." She paused, letting the words settle. Then her eyes scanned the crowd, deliberately passing over Mark and his friends until they found me. She locked her gaze on mine, and in that moment, it felt again as if we were the only two people in the universe. "Some of you here today might know my father, Mark Collin," she said, her voice remaining level, but with an undercurrent of steel. "He's a successful man. He builds things. He makes deals. And he has some of his friends and colleagues here with him today." A murmur went through the audience. Mark's face was now a mask of horror. He knew. He knew what was coming. "Just a few moments ago," Lily continued, her eyes still locked on mine, "I heard my father introduce my mother to his friends. He called her my nanny. He told them she was a godsend. I want to correct the record." A collective, soft gasp rippled through the people closest to the stage. The silence in the hall was now absolute, heavy, and profound. The woman he pointed to, Lily's voice began to tremble, not with weakness, but with the sheer force of the love she was about to unleash, "is not my nanny. She is my mother. Her name is Carla. She is not a godsend in the way he means. She is my everything. She is the woman who worked 2 jobs cleaning other people's houses so I could have books to read and a roof over my head. She's the one who stayed up with me all night when I had a fever and the one who taught me how to ride a bike. She's the one who sat at a cold bus stop at 5 a.m. every morning so I could get to the right school." Tears were now streaming down my face, hot and unstoppable. The shame I had felt just moments before was being washed away by a tidal wave of love, so powerful and so public it was almost overwhelming. "The man who called her a nanny," Lily went on, finally turning her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the spot where her father stood, a statue carved from humiliation. "He paid for my tuition. That is true. And for that, I suppose I should be grateful. But my mother paid for my life. She paid with her sleep, with her sweat, with her tears, with the best years of her own life. She didn't just send me here. She carried me here on her back." She raised the rose again, a triumphant standard. "So when you look at me, a graduate of this fine institution, please do not see the legacy of my father's wealth. You see the legacy of a mother's love. That is the true honor. That is the whole story." She placed the rose gently on the podium, turned and walked back down the stairs, her head held high. The silence held for a beat, and then the applause started. It wasn't the polite celebratory applause from before. It was a roar. It was a thunderous, rolling ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. People were getting to their feet, their faces filled with emotion, their clapping echoing with respect and admiration. They weren't just clapping for Lily. They were clapping for me. They were clapping for the truth. As the applause thundered around me, I stood rooted to the spot, completely overwhelmed. The world had tilted on its axis. The shame and humiliation that had been my silent companions for so long had been publicly vanquished, not by an act of revenge, but by an act of pure, unadulterated love. Through my tears, I saw Mark. He was ashen-faced, his mask of confident success shattered into a million pieces. His colleagues were avoiding his gaze, looking at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at the man who had just been so thoroughly and elegantly exposed. Without a word, they turned, a small, defeated cluster, and moved towards the exit, melting into the crowd and disappearing. He didn't look back. At that moment, I didn't feel hatred or even satisfaction at his defeat. I felt a profound sense of release, as if a heavy chain I hadn't even fully realized I was dragging had just been unshackled from my soul. People began to move around me, but the energy had shifted. As they passed, strangers would catch my eye. A woman with kind eyes and pearls that now seemed to shine with warmth reached out and gently touched my arm. "Your daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "is extraordinary. And so are you." An older man, the one who had boasted about his salutatorian son, simply nodded at me, a look of deep, undisguised respect on his face. I was no longer the nanny. I was no longer invisible. I was Carla, Lily's mother. I was a woman who had been seen. And then, Lily was there. She pushed through the last few people separating us and wrapped her arms around me. I buried my face in her shoulder, breathing in the scent of her hair, and finally let out the sob I had been holding back. It wasn't a sob of pain, but of catharsis. I held her tight, feeling the solid, strong woman she had become. "You didn't have to do that," I whispered into her gown, my voice choked with tears. She pulled back just enough to look at me, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. She cupped my face in her hands, her touch so gentle. "Yes, I did, Mom," she said, her voice fierce and soft all at once. "I've spent my whole life watching you be my hero in private. It was time everyone else knew it too." She took my hand and placed the single, perfect rose back into it. "This is yours," she said. "It was always yours." As we walked out of that grand auditorium and into the bright afternoon sun, a new chapter of our lives began. It wasn't just Lily who had graduated that day. In a way, I had too. I had graduated from a long, painful class in silence and survival. Lily's words had been my diploma, her courage my honor. She had given me back my name, my story, my dignity. Not by erasing the past, but by illuminating it for all to see. The story of that day became a quiet legend in our family, a reminder that the most powerful truths are often the simplest ones, and that true strength isn't about the absence of wounds, but about the courage to show our scars. Love, I learned, is its own form of justice. It doesn't always shout, but when it speaks, its voice can be loud enough to fill the most cavernous of halls and heal the deepest of hurts. We all have people in our lives who work tirelessly in the background, whose sacrifices become the silent foundation upon which we build our dreams. Perhaps it is a mother, a father, a grandparent, or a friend. Their love is often a quiet force, a steady hand on our back that we can sometimes take for granted. Take a moment to see them. Truly see them. Don't let their story go untold, because acknowledging their love is the most beautiful honor we can ever give. It is the rose we place back in their hand, a simple testament to the greatest truth of all, that we are and will always be the legacy of their love.